Dr. Eberhard, Nahtoderfahrung, das ist ein...
Dr. Eberhard, near-death experience is a term that has only existed for the past few decades, and it sums up experiences that people have who are close to death. Were such reports also documented in former times, for example in the Middle Ages?
Yes, these things did exist. Of course, it requires some meticulousness to look for such cases. In the 1980s, a religious scholar called Karol Zaleski looked for such cases that occurred in particular during the Middle Ages. She summarized these cases in a book, her dissertation, and thanks to her, we've got a few glimpses. However, she also incorporates a lot of visions in her research. In retrospect, it's partially a bit difficult to distinguish whether these cases are near-death experiences or visions. Nevertheless, in some cases it is quite clear to tell that they were near-death experiences because of their triggers and content.
Are there similarities between the records from the Middle Ages and today's near-death experiences, or are there generally completely different aspects documented?
Well, there are definitely similarities. However, there are different shades that change sometimes. In the end, people have the feeling that they leave their body to enter a different world, and there they get in contact with this world for which they need a certain figure, a leader or a sort of protector, a person that welcomes them and explains everything. That's what it requires to be a near-death experience, in a sense. And these aspects you can also find in the Middle Ages, but more in the position of authority, like a leading teacher who protects, who teaches, who shows things, but who is also strict. And although we don't have much evidence, there are also fewer relatives who appear in these near-death experiences, which is quite normal by today's standards. Because today, it is quite normal to meet relatives. This doesn't seem to be relevant in the Middle Ages. Maybe they thought they wouldn't really have a say over there. And it's interesting because we find similar structures in India. There was some research done in the 1970s where deathbed visions and near-death experiences were examined. And then, these cases were compared in context with near-death experiences in the Western world. And they found the same elements that, let's say, seem to be dominant in the Middle Ages in Europe. It's very interesting because we find them also in Indian near-death experiences. Another interesting aspect, for example, are mix-ups. Pope Clemens collected such cases of near-death experience in order to educate and warn his citizens. And he described a near-death experience of a traveling salesman whose name was Stefan, who was on the way back from Constantinople to Italy. He got very sick and left his body and went to hell. And there he also met a guiding figure who looked into a book and said, "Ah, this is Stefan the salesman, but we need Stefan the carpenter." There was a different type of occupation somehow, and he said, "That's the one we need. Send the salesman back." And so he went back into his body. So this is the misunderstanding, this mix-up. This is something we usually don't find in European or American near-death experiences today. We've never really heard of these. However, this is something you would find in India. It hasn't been the case just once that somebody is sent back because the time hasn't come yet. We've heard of these cases. It's not the time yet, go back. But we don't know these cases in the sense of a mix-up. What is also understandable and interesting is that Pope Clemens even then interpreted it in a way that it wasn't heaven that could have been responsible for this mix-up. This was out of the question, but that it was a warning for that person.
One experience is the borderline experience. It's a border that when we cross it, we are immediately led to a world of the hereafter. Were such images also passed down from the Middle Ages?
Yes, here I can actually continue talking about this case. Pope Clemens then described that on the day this Stefan was sent back, the other Stefan actually died in Rome. And he continued the story. He said that a Roman soldier during the occupation of the city, this happened in the early Middle Ages during an occupation, that this soldier was wounded and he also left his body and came into a world of the hereafter. So it was clearly a near-death experience. And there was a river, but this river wasn't beautiful. This river was odorous and dark. There were demonic figures in the river, and this river had to be crossed when you wanted to get to the other side, to the Elysium, the paradise. But this paradise was already quite close. You could already see the flowers. You could already smell the heavenly sphere. So you could already smell it. And this soldier had to cross this bridge. But it wasn't his turn yet. It was the other Stefan's turn, the one I had mentioned before. And according to Clemens, he died and wanted to cross the bridge. And there is something that happened to the ones that were not ready to cross the bridge yet. Then he fell off the bridge. And up there, he could see light beings that tried to pull him to their side. And there was some demon under the bridge that tried to grab him. And that's how the near-death experience of this soldier ended. He came back and reported it. So we've got this symbol as well, this symbol of the border. And if this soldier had crossed this bridge, he probably wouldn't have come back. I think it was even mentioned that it was Stefan's turn. We don't know how he came back. And on the other side of this bridge was this paradise. But I've got to say that it isn't that clear whether this bridge, this river, is the border or more like a sort of tribunal or last judgment that was brought forward. And this bridge was this famous Chinvant bridge that turns into a grid and everyone has to cross it. And people who are sinful, when their sins predominated during someone's lifetime, then the bridge becomes as thin as a knife and the person falls into the abyss. And the ones where we'd say that they lived a good life, the bridge would stay wide. So the width of the bridge depends on the, let's say, moral qualities or the lifestyle of the person.
So there are aspects of these former times that also occur today. Overall, these medieval traditions sound a bit more fairy tale-like. Do you think that today we are more likely to look at people's experiences more objectively?
No, I wouldn't say so. But I've got to say that these stories that we know from the Middle Ages are already a selection. So it is hard to say in how far near-death experiences were selected that somehow confirmed this norm. In the sense of the Catholic faith, I can quite imagine that there were also near-death experiences that did not conform to Catholicism. Those weren't even told and recorded, or they weren't included in this collection. That's one point. Then it could have also been the case in the Middle Ages, and that's something we know as well. That in the Middle Ages, they weren't quite so pedantic when it came to the truth. For example, when somebody signed, they oftentimes used the wrong name. They compiled things, put things together and changed them, or they just passed things on orally. So it's very likely that these possibilities that I just mentioned might have falsified these cases. However, regarding your question whether people in the Middle Ages were, let's say, less objective than today, I doubt that, because every time claims that they are at their peak, at their highest peak, and that they understand things the best. This wasn't any different in the Middle Ages, although they had the role model of the ancient times. That's something we don't have anymore. Today, we wouldn't say that the ancient times were more ahead than us, and still, the current way of thinking, that, apparently, the current culture that shapes the contents of near-death experiences without questioning them, this was also accepted in former times, and was seen as being valid, like today.
Do you see other similarities or typical differences in near-death experiences in former times compared to today?
The things that are similar the most are not really surprising. They are the things that happen on a worldly level, that affect the body, such as injuries, the danger to life as initial position. Then we also have the leaving of the body and returning into the body. These things were also described by people from the Middle Ages. And of course nowadays, we've got a very differentiated description. It is something that is difficult. It's something that's painful. Somebody from the Middle Ages also described how he had to return to this cold and stinking body, how difficult it was for him. And of course, it's always assumed that these near-death experiences that the people involved went through, let's say like Dante, down into hell first and came back with this leading figure, and they went through this purification, and they came to Elysian and beautiful regions that are non-describable, and from there they went back into their bodies because they were sent back, and they also got a task, and that's very, very difficult. And the things that happen afterwards are very similar as they are today. Well, those people are not the same anymore. For example, in 2 cases, the men became monks after they had a near-death experience. They sold all their property, but they had a family too. We don't know any details, but you can imagine that these things didn't happen without tensions. And today, people who had near-death experiences are still in a similar situation. They come back as a different person, although it's a new experience that would just take a few seconds in the world here, and they are pressed into this experience, which can have a huge permanent effect on the rest of their lives. This seems to be the case in the Middle Ages and today. However, the one thing that seems to be different is, here I think we have to take a look at the imagination of the hereafter in those times, namely, what or who people meet in the hereafter, which is comparable to the near-death experiences in India. Authority plays an important role here. In Indian culture, as well as in the European Middle Ages, the Book of Life is a deciding factor. Well, we know that especially the life review is, let's say, an original of modern near-death experiences. That's something we've only seen in modern near-death experiences. The life review is something quite specific and has been described so many times and is so impressive, and also diverse that it actually builds its own entity. In the Middle Ages, and also the times before, we don't have the life review. There, somebody reads something from a book, so it's an authority again. Or I also find it quite impressive that during the panorama of life, people often describe that the person isn't assessed, but I mean the person as such isn't assessed, and shouldn't be prosecuted, but that they should see it as an introspection of their life. What did I think? What did I do? What did I trigger? And then they also relive these scenes and the reaction of the others, so they see everything that is good and bad on the same level and relive it in the same way. So in this sense, it doesn't need a tribunal that reads something to this person. It's actually a very impressive and beautiful version. And as I said, this is something that we actually don't find in the Middle Ages, or it hasn't been recorded, or it might have existed but wasn't understood at the time, because only a few people who had any kind of authority had the ability to write these things down. And of course, there was also the context of religion. Especially in the Middle Ages, things only had a meaning in connection with religion. May it be art, or an experience a person had, all these things had to fit into this concept of religion. Otherwise, it wasn't worthy enough to be recorded.
So, can we conclude that the belief system of a person influences the worldview of a person and also the way they experience a near-death experience?
This is something we've seen over and over again. Here, we can only focus on modern near-death experiences, and we become even more aware of that when we look at them from a cultural perspective. There may be different cultures, but in the same period of time. But also, when we go back chronologically and take a look at near-death experiences there, you can still find elements or parts of these elements that were described by Moody years ago, who described and defined these elements for the first time, and whether these elements were generally valid. On the one hand, we've got aspects that reoccur and that are specific for near-death experiences. And on the other hand, when it's about the content and interpretation of near-death experiences, we see a lot of cultural and intercultural variance and differences. So we've got a huge number of differences here.
What about the times even before the Middle Ages? Was anything passed down from antiquity?
Well, I'm very curious because when it comes to antiquity, not much has been researched yet. Also, there was some research done by Professor Eno Erzhard Popks, who is a professor in Kiel, a theologist who tackled this topic and examined near-death experiences in ancient times, and their effects on that time. The only case that is known to me that I would categorize as a near-death experience is the case of the soldier Er, which was described by Plato in his book Republic. He dedicated several pages to this case, which was very impressive. It was also very moral, and it was worth a lot to Plato to write about it. Of course, we need to take this with a pinch of salt because this experience profoundly matches, let's say, Plato's philosophy. And nevertheless, there isn't really a reason for me to doubt this immediately, because it seems quite authentic to me. Because the elements that we know from near-death experiences also appear there.
Could you principally imagine that near-death experiences might be something that could be initial impulses for the emergence of religions? Religion in the sense of experiential knowledge.
It's an interesting thought, I'd imagine, in a different way, but of course, it's in the dark. I often think, and that's an experience I've had myself, that in cultures that are close to nature, that we can't find in Europe anymore, that the closer a culture is to nature and the simpler, as we say, a culture is structured and the less they have contact in modern times, the more normal they find supernatural experiences and the closer they are to religious feelings. And talking about this topic is completely relaxed and somehow not restricted by dogmas and the mind or skeptical views. It's almost childlike, and it's clear to me that the further we go back in time, the more we go back to, let's say, to a childish phase of humanity, who of course had fewer problems in tackling this topic. And the question whether there is something like a supernatural world, it was easier for them to have contact to this world. And it didn't need near-death experiences to feel this world. Or I think there were certain people who were clairvoyant, or maybe could see this other world. In those times, they probably didn't need near-death experiences. And when it comes to the foundation of religions, let's say the big religions, we can only find a few indications that near-death experiences were such triggers. We could maybe mention the experience of Paulus, when he fell off the horse, which was interpreted as epilepsy, but I also think that this was a vision. This case wasn't necessarily a near-death experience, but of course, the two are quite similar. What I mean is, spiritual experiences, mystic experiences, near-death experiences, a deep near-death experience is a deeply mystic experience and is similar to, or even the same as, experiences that can be experienced without being close to death.
In any case, today the term near-death experience helps many people to categorize their experiences. Dr. Eberhard, many thanks for your explanations and many thanks for this interview.
Many thanks.